Hi, everybody. Welcome back. There's a lot happening in the world right now, and it feels grounding, at least to me, to get to talk about the questions that we face day to day that are about work. And so, for folks who are here for the first time, I'm Roy. I'm a startup investor in the future of work, and we love bringing in our extended group of friends to give perspectives on things. And Dan is rare because he both has served in the startup world in various capacities, and prior to that was served our country. Is a West Point grad who served in the Army, and has had the experience of the thing we're going to talk about. And so, Dan, the question for you today is, we often talk about a career switch, but the question to me is, if you have to make multiple switches, how do you go about that? Because the first one's sometimes easy to explain. Like, by the second time, people start to worry, is this a dilettante? Are they going to bounce around all the time? And yet some of the most interesting careers have had that. So would love any and all perspective, and really grateful for you being here.
Yeah, no, exactly. Thanks for the question and for having me. I learned, as you mentioned sort of briefly, I learned sort of how to navigate this question through my own journey. When I left the military 14 years ago, I was not at all sure what I wanted to do. And have worked across a number of different industries and sort of had to kind of learn how to create. Often it's really a narrative bridge. I think it's really a narrative bridge plus the right relationships to get you from one to the next, and see this as really one industry, one experience, one career kind of building on the others, as opposed to kind of what you talked about, like, why is this question hard? Potentially there's this like stigma of, is this person a job hopper? Are they just unsure what they want or what they bring or who they are? And so, how do you actually sort of get past either that stigma in your own mind, which often a challenge is the stories we're telling ourselves, but two, then how do you actually get that across to other people?
By the way, I think that point you just made is so powerful, because so often I find people, when they're asking me about career stuff, they'll basically be trying to make sense of their own life story, find some essential kernel. And of course, we all want that for ourselves.
Yep.
Like, we don't want to feel like we're just like pool balls bouncing around. But the person hiring you, they don't necessarily have the capacity at first to internalize the fullness of your life.
Yep.
And so you have to be, I think, selective about how do you authentically share something that's real without burdening them with like, well, and they took this sideways turn for 2 days, because whatever. So yeah, would love to hear what you believe can work.
Yeah, well, so we could probably do a whole session actually on just that question of, when you get the question of tell me about yourself, how do you answer that without telling someone your whole life story, right? But in this case, I think what it really comes down to is like, one, a compelling narrative that's based on conviction and logic, meaning like you have to believe this is the right next step for me. And there has to be like a really clear logic chain that someone else can follow to understand why this pivot makes sense to you and it should make sense to them, right? And as you're building out that story, I think the whole approach, not just the storytelling approach, but the transition from one to the next, I think of it as a research project, right? You're building a hypothesis as to what you want next and why you'd be good at it. And you have to get out there in the world and test those hypotheses via conversations with other people.
Right? And so we'd just love to hear an example or two of the kind of thing that you think passes the smell test.
Like the smell test of a compelling...
Of the compelling enough logic.
Yeah. So for me, actually, I work with a lot of veterans through their transitions. One was
such an important thing, by the way. I feel like one of our great losses as a country is how difficult it is to kind of find appropriate matches for veterans who are leaving the service. But sorry, keep going.
Well, no. So I think it's one, I do transitions just from the military into civilian life, but then also folks kind of come back to me later, right? So
sure, the first thing may not stick.
Exactly. So I worked with a guy who was a West Point grad, went to HBS after the military, went to Boston Consulting Group for a couple of years after that. And in his mind, at that time, the narrative was, I'm going to do this for a couple of years to get some more business experience, and then I'm going to move on to the next phase of my career. He got into Boston Consulting Group. A couple of years in, he kind of hits the upper out ceiling, and they say, hey, it's time to find something else. And now the story in his head is, I'm a failure. I wasn't as good as these other consultants.
Because I tried this single thing, it didn't quite work, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And so step one for him was, reframing that to, wait a minute, this was actually your plan all along.
Right.
Was to do this one thing and then move to something else. But two, we started with exploring really what are his core interests and passions, and like what bodies of work might he be excited getting out of bed to work on every day. And that then became kind of this logic bridge of, I built this experience at BCG, I built this experience in the military, and I really care about climate change. And so that's why I'm moving into this heat pump startup, and why it makes the most sense.
Yeah. And I mean, look, the reality is that many of the ways we figure out what we want to work on is by working on something.
Exactly.
And so sometimes you work on something only to realize, actually, I thought I wanted to do that, but it's not what I want to do. For example, I thought, I wanted a role running the digital side of a major American news organization. I then was the CEO of a small media company or medium-sized media company, and got offered that job and realized I actually no longer wanted to do that because of what I had learned running the company I'd run, which is that I liked running things and I liked tech, and as opposed to media per se, and . And I think there's another insight in there that I really want to underline that you said, which is we often think of the next job as sort of the stopping point when you're the end point. When you're having a conversation with a hirer, it's like, well, this may be the be all and end all. And the reality is, chances are it's not. And so just preparing yourself mentally for that, I think is really powerful. What are some of the ways that you see people glitch, where they try to narrate the transition or figure out what they want to do for a second switch, and then it just doesn't quite work?
Yeah. Well, one, I think, is like maybe jumping on an opportunity too quickly, right? If someone has an idea, or they say, someone's getting ready for a pivot, they're looking for something new. And often, people with big networks go reach out to their friends and they hear, oh, there's this one, there's this one, there's this one. And they might just jump on something without actually doing the research and the prep work to kind of develop that conviction and that really clear understanding of what is this industry, what do they value, how does my experience apply, what can I bring from one to the next, and how might I enjoy this? So I think step one is just like, you have to do the work yourself to really understand where you're going and why. Two, though, I think, again, is like most people, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of people that I encounter don't really zoom out. And, there's that Steve Jobs quote about how like the dots don't really make sense until you look back. Your career only really makes sense. There's a common thread if you can actually look in the rearview mirror. It can be really powerful if you actually do that work and see how this has built on this, has built on this.
Yeah.
You can tell that story in a way that doesn't feel sloppy of, oh, I tried this, then I tried that, then I did this. But instead it's like, oh, that all did make sense to me, right? And so if you haven't really done that work to kind of make sense of your own career, you're not going to be able to help someone else make sense of it.
I think that's totally valid. The other thing I wonder about is, as you've worked with different kind of clients, how much does it matter, do you think, what kind of career they're coming into or out of? Because certain places seem more tolerant of that. Like, for example, if I'm going into a junior level sales role, they may not care where I was before. Like, they just want to know, like, am I willing to do the thing and try to produce? Or they may care less. And then the other is, that's kind of related to that, is just personal background of the person. If somebody's from the military, do they handle it differently? Race, gender, there's just a bunch of different factors about a person that can affect how they approach this problem. And I'm just curious how much of it varies depending on the circumstances.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, any non-traditional candidate who, and that can mean a whole bunch of different things, right? Like all the categories you just mentioned, you're already kind of at a disadvantage just sort of throwing your resume into the machine online, right? I think you absolutely have to build relationships with people over time and help them see who you are and the value you bring. And like your value may not automatically leap off the page, right?
Yeah.
I made a transition I spent 3 years at LinkedIn running the military and veterans program there, and made a transition over to Sequoia Capital. And I was running like founder development programs basically there. And a friend of mine, really a sponsor, she wasn't just a mentor, she was the one who said, I know the CMO over there, you'd be a great fit. I know your background really well, you'd be perfect for this. Sequoia was employing like an agency basically to run the search for them. My friend sends them my resume, and within 5 minutes, he responds back and says, not a fit, right? And she was the one who pressed and said, no, you're not seeing it. This guy has done this and this and this. And so often you do need kind of an advocate somewhere in the system to really, tell your story for you, or, just someone who can, help you realize, how am I framing my story in this new industry that I have not yet been a part of? What do they value? What of my background is the thing that's most important or impressive to them? It might be different than what I think is most important or impressive.
Yeah, right? I mean, I think that recon is really useful. And, sometimes, and especially harder for people who are coming from a background that's just less represented somewhere, it's cultivating that ally before you slam in your resume. Because oftentimes slamming in your resume is like a last resort. And I also think that there's an aspect of it which applies to any switch, and maybe the second switch, it's just more difficult, is just reducing the risk for the person hiring you.
Right.
Oftentimes what they're really thinking is not, can you do the job? They're not like staring into your eyes and looking at the resume and thinking, is this person great? What they're really thinking is, when I tell my coworkers who I have hired and what their background is, what will they think of me and my choice? And the less of an obvious fit you are, the more they're staking their personal capital on you. And they may not know you well enough to stake their personal capital on you. And so figuring out a way to reduce that cost, in my case, when I went from government into media, it was, I don't care what title I have. So, they could hire me and say, this guy's willing to do, like, he's done some real stuff, and here he's willing to show up without a title. And it's just little things like that. Sometimes I suggest to people that they offer to work on a project at first, the how to do it depends on the circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. You do, I think, if you're sort of in more of an exploratory career, so to speak, going from one industry to the next, you do kind of have to check your ego at the door, because every time you move to a new industry, you are taking a step. You're not starting completely again, but like
totally, there's some adjustment.
Yeah. So,
and yet I think those are some of the most valuable careers. All right. Any parting thoughts before we wrap?
I think that one important thing to just be aware of is having a really honest awareness of where the gap is, right? Like, you may be bringing a bunch of assets, to this new organization, new role, et cetera, but being open, honest, and aware of what you still need to learn, and then showing them proof that you can, right?
Yeah, or at least willingness. I think it's really powerful.
Risk.
I think people overly focus on, like, a failure mode I've seen that comes out of that is people overly focus. We've talked about this before in other questions people have had here on This Is Not Advice, is on translation. How can I take the thing I've done in the military, for example, and show people it's really similar to the thing they're doing at a DevOps company or something like that? And while of course there's validity to that, everything translates, it's like a faded copy in a way. And nobody really gives you much credit for that. And that's okay. Like, you don't have to justify to them that you've done it. You just have to justify you're capable of doing it, which is a subtle difference, but an important one.
Oh, 100%. And I actually think that the transferability question can often come down to, like, this is the mindset of someone doing this type of thing in the military. These are the thought frameworks that they're using. Those are the same that you use. It's just a different context, right?
Amen.
So it may not be like a surface level skill transfer. It's more of a, like, I think the same way you do. We're just
and it can show, the attempt to translate can show people disrespect for what you're doing, and it often comes from an inner need to validate the ego of what I did was worth it for this, and that may be true, but the other person may just not care, and that's not their job to care. Their job is to find you a role. All right, well, I'll just say the reason we call this Is Not Advice is because neither of us knows what anybody else
absolutely,
but you're giving a lot of wisdom that's worked for you and your clients. And so I think that's really valuable. And I'll just say, the way we do this is, we talk to friends about the issues that are on their mind, and we take questions from people who are watching. We got a good, healthy audience right now. And so folks, feel free to ask questions. And Dan, I'm just excited to see what unfolds for you in whatever switches there may be now and in the future. Currently an executive coach with a group called Propel, and we shall see what unfolds from here. So thank you very much, and to be continued.
Thank you. Appreciate it.